A decision that split my family in half and made me question whether I'm a terrible person. When my younger brother lost his job and needed a place to stay, everyone expected me to open the doors of my house without hesitation. But after years of problems, lies, and destructive behavior, I said no. Now my own family treats me like the villain of the story. You're going to judge whether I was too cruel or if I finally established necessary boundaries. This isn't just about housing arrangements. It's about family loyalty, personal boundaries, and the moment I chose my own well-being over family expectations. Leave in the comments, would you have done what I did? It was a Tuesday evening in March when my phone rang at exactly 9:47 p.m. I remember the time so clearly because I was in the middle of my favorite Netflix show, finally relaxing after a brutal 12-hour workday at the accounting firm where I'm a senior associate. The caller ID showed Jake, brother, and my heart immediately sank. Jake never called me anymore unless he needed something, and calls this late usually meant trouble. "Emma, thank God you answered." Jake's voice came through the phone, shaky and desperate. "I really need to talk to you about something important. Can you sit down?" That phrase, "can you sit down," had become Jake's signature opening for delivering bad news over the past 5 years. I'd heard it before he told me about getting fired from his job at the warehouse, before he confessed to crashing his girlfriend's car while drunk, before he admitted to stealing money from our parents' emergency fund. "What happened now, Jake?" I asked, already feeling that familiar knot forming in my stomach. I paused my show and prepared myself for whatever crisis he was about to dump in my lap. "I got evicted," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "The landlord gave me 3 days to get out. I'm completely broke, Emma. I've been looking for work for weeks, but nobody's hiring, and I don't have anywhere else to go. I know we haven't been close lately, but you're my sister. You're the only person I can turn to right now." The silence that followed felt like it stretched on forever. I knew what he was asking without him having to say it directly. He wanted to move into my house. The beautiful 3-bedroom colonial I'd bought just 2 years ago after working my ass off to save for a down payment. The house that represented everything I'd accomplished. My sanctuary from the chaos that had defined my childhood and early adulthood. "Jake, I started, but he cut me off before I could finish my thought. I know I've made mistakes, Emma. I know I haven't always been the best brother, but I'm trying to get my life together, I swear. I just need a few months to get back on my feet, find a steady job, save up some money. I won't be any trouble, I promise. You won't even know I'm there." That promise, "you won't even know I'm there," was almost laughable considering Jake's history. Jake had never been anywhere without making his presence known in the most disruptive ways possible. But the desperation in his voice was real, and despite everything we'd been through, he was still my little brother. Before I could respond, Jake continued his plea. "Mom and Dad are expecting you to help me. I already talked to them, and they said you have all that extra space in your house. They said family takes care of family no matter what. They're waiting for me to call them back and tell them you said yes." And there it was, the family pressure card that I knew was coming. The expectation that because I was successful and stable, I was somehow obligated to rescue Jake from the consequences of his own choices, just like I'd been doing since we were children. To understand why Jake's request filled me with such dread, you need to know our history. Jake is 3 years younger than me, and for as long as I can remember, he's been what people politely call troubled. What started as typical teenage rebellion when he was 15, staying out past curfew, experimenting with alcohol, skipping school occasionally, gradually escalated into something much more serious and destructive. By the time Jake turned 18, he was fully addicted to cocaine and alcohol. I'll never forget the night our parents found him passed out in the basement, surrounded by drug paraphernalia, barely breathing. That was the first of many rock-bottom moments that would define the next several years of our family's life. Jake went to rehab 3 different times between the ages of 18 and 25. Each time, our parents mortgaged their financial future to pay for expensive treatment programs. Each time, Jake would emerge clean and sober and full of promises about changing his life, and each time, within 6 months, he'd relapse harder than before. The lying became pathological. Jake would look you straight in the eye and tell you elaborate stories that were complete fabrications. He stole from everyone in our family, money from our parents' wallets, jewelry from our grandmother's house, even my college textbooks, which he sold for drug money. He borrowed my car once and returned it 3 days later with the front bumper smashed and the interior reeking of vomit and alcohol. When Jake was 23, he got his girlfriend pregnant. Sarah was a sweet girl from his high school who genuinely loved him and believed she could save him from his addictions. For about 6 months, it looked like impending fatherhood might be the motivation Jake needed to get clean. He got a job at a local auto parts store, started attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings regularly, and seemed to be taking responsibility for his life. Then Sarah had a miscarriage in her second trimester, and Jake completely fell apart. He disappeared for 2 weeks, during which we later learned he'd been on a cocaine and alcohol binge that nearly killed him. Sarah, heartbroken and exhausted from trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved, finally walked away from the relationship. The pattern continued for years. Jake would get clean, find a job, rent an apartment, and start to build some stability. Then something would trigger him: stress, disappointment, boredom, or sometimes nothing at all. And he'd destroy everything he'd worked to build. He'd get fired for showing up to work high, get evicted for not paying rent, lose girlfriends who couldn't handle the chaos anymore. Each time Jake hit rock bottom, our parents would bail him out. They'd pay his debts, find him a new apartment, co-sign loans he had no intention of repaying. They enabled his destructive behavior by constantly rescuing him from consequences, and I watched them drain their retirement savings and damage their own relationship in the process. So what do you think so far? Can you already see why Jake's request to move in with me felt like such a loaded question? Am I wrong to be skeptical of his promises based on this history? Let me know in the comments what you would be thinking in my situation. I want to thank everyone who's still watching this story unfold. Your engagement and comments mean everything to me, and I promise you, the most shocking revelations are still coming. You're not going to believe how this situation escalated. To understand why Jake's request felt like such a violation, you need to know what my house means to me. It's not just a building or an investment, it's a symbol of everything I've overcome and accomplished despite growing up in the chaos that Jake's addiction created in our family. My childhood was defined by instability and crisis management. There were nights when I couldn't bring friends over because Jake was high or drunk and causing scenes. There were family vacations canceled because Jake had gotten arrested or hospitalized. There were countless dinners interrupted by phone calls, from police stations, hospitals, or rehab centers. As the older sibling, I became the family's emotional caretaker from a very young age. I was the one who found Jake when he overdosed at 16, performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, and held our mother while she sobbed in the hospital waiting room. I was the one who covered for him when he stole from our grandmother, lying to protect him even though it made me complicit in his crimes. I threw myself into academics and work as an escape from the chaos at home. While other teenagers were going to parties and dating, I was working part-time jobs and studying obsessively to maintain my scholarship eligibility. I knew that education was my ticket out of the dysfunction, my path to a different kind of life. After graduating summa cum laude from Ohio State with a degree in accounting, I got hired by a prestigious firm in Columbus and started building the stable, peaceful life I'd always dreamed of. For the first time in my life, I could come home to silence. I could invite friends over without worrying about what embarrassing scene might unfold. I could plan my future without factoring in someone else's crises and emergencies. Buying my house 2 years ago was the culmination of everything I'd worked for. It's a beautiful 1950s colonial in a quiet neighborhood called Clintonville, with hardwood floors throughout, a renovated kitchen with granite countertops, and a backyard where I've planted a garden that brings me incredible peace. Every room reflects my personal taste and style. Clean, organized, serene spaces where I can finally breathe. The house has 3 bedrooms, which people constantly point out when suggesting I should let Jake move in. What they don't understand is that I use every inch of that space intentionally. One bedroom is my office where I work from home 2 days a week. Another is a guest room that I've decorated carefully for when friends or my parents visit. The third is my bedroom, my sanctuary, where I can lock the door and know that I'm safe from drama and chaos. The thought of Jake living in my carefully cultivated space, bringing his unpredictability and destruction into the peace I'd worked so hard to create, made me feel physically sick. I'd seen what happened to every place Jake lived: apartments destroyed by parties, furniture broken during fits of rage, walls punched full of holes during withdrawal episodes. The morning after Jake's phone call, my mother called me at 7 a.m., before I'd even had my first cup of coffee. I knew immediately that Jake had already talked to her, probably spinning his situation to make it sound like a temporary setback, rather than the latest in a long pattern of self-destruction. "Emma, honey, your father and I need to talk to you about Jake's situation," my mother began, using that careful tone she always employed when she was about to ask me to sacrifice something for my brother's sake. "He's really struggling right now, and he needs our support as a family." "Mom, I know he called you, but this isn't as simple as it sounds," I tried to explain. "Jake has been struggling for 10 years. Every time we bail him out, we just enable him to make the same mistakes again." "That's not fair, Emma," my mother said, her voice getting sharper. "Jake has been working really hard to get his life together. This eviction isn't his fault. His roommate bailed on him and left him with the full rent payment. He's been applying for jobs every day, but the job market is tough right now." I later learned that Jake's version of events was significantly different from reality, but at the time, I only had his word to go on. Still, something about the story didn't add up. Jake had been telling us for months that he was doing well, that his job at the restaurant was going great, that he was saving money and getting his life on track. "Even if that's true, Mom, I'm not comfortable having Jake live in my house. We've been down this road before and it never ends well. I've worked really hard to build a stable, peaceful life, and I'm not willing to risk that." The disappointment in my mother's voice was crushing. "Emma, I never thought I'd hear you talk about your own brother like he's some kind of burden. He's family. Family takes care of each other, especially when times are tough. You have a big house with plenty of room, and Jake has nowhere else to go." Over the next few days, the pressure intensified exponentially. My father called to express his disappointment in my selfishness. My aunt, my mother's sister, who had always been close to our family, left me a voicemail saying she was shocked and saddened by my refusal to help Jake in his time of need. The worst was when my grandmother, my father's mother, who was 86, years old and had always been my biggest supporter, called me crying. "Emma, sweetheart, I don't understand why you won't help your brother. He's made mistakes, but he's still family. What would your grandfather think about you turning your back? On blood?" That phone call nearly broke me. My grandmother had been the one stable, loving presence in my chaotic childhood. She had paid for my college application fees when our parents couldn't afford them, celebrated every one of my academic achievements, and told me repeatedly how proud she was of the woman I'd become. Hearing disappointment in her voice made me question everything about my decision. My extended family started choosing sides. Cousins who barely knew the details of Jake's history were posting on social media about the importance of family loyalty. My uncle sent me a long text message about how successful people have an obligation to help those less fortunate, especially family members. The guilt was overwhelming. I started questioning whether I was being selfish and cruel, whether my desire for peace and stability was more important than my brother's basic need for shelter. Was I punishing Jake for his past mistakes instead of giving him a chance to prove he'd changed? What my family didn't fully understand, or chose to forget, was that this wasn't the first time I'd tried to help Jake get back on his feet. Over the years, I'd given him money, co-signed leases, helped him find jobs, and even let him stay in my previous apartment for what was supposed to be just a few weeks, but turned into 3 nightmarish months. The apartment incident happened about 4 years ago when I was living in a 2-bedroom place near downtown Columbus. Jake had just gotten out of his second stint in rehab and claimed he was committed to staying sober and rebuilding his life. He needed a place to stay while he looked for work and saved money for his own apartment. Against my better judgment, I agreed to let him crash on my couch temporarily. Jake promised he would be quiet, clean, and respectful of my space and my schedule. He swore he would be actively job hunting every day and would be out of my place within a month at the most. The reality was completely different. Jake treated my apartment like a frat house. He brought random people over at all hours of the night without asking permission or giving me any notice. He left messes everywhere, dirty dishes in the sink for days, garbage overflowing, bathroom supplies used up without replacement. He ate my food without asking and never contributed to groceries or household expenses. Worse than the mess and inconsideration was the lying. Jake would tell me he was going to job interviews when he was actually meeting up with old friends who were still using drugs. He claimed to be attending AA meetings when he was spending afternoons at bars. I'd find beer cans hidden in my bedroom closet and cocaine residue on my coffee table. The final straw came when I returned from a work conference to find that Jake had thrown a party in my apartment while I was gone. There were cigarette burns on my furniture, red wine stains on my carpet, and one of my framed photographs had been broken. My neighbors complained about the noise, and my landlord threatened to evict me for violating the lease terms about guests and parties. When I confronted Jake about the party, he denied everything despite the obvious evidence. He claimed the damages had been there before, that I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid and controlling. When I told him he had to leave immediately, he became verbally abusive, calling me selfish and heartless and accusing me of abandoning family when they needed me most. I had to change the locks on my apartment because Jake had made copies of my keys without permission. For weeks after I kicked him out, he would show up at random times, sometimes drunk or high, demanding to be let in and causing scenes that embarrassed me with my neighbors. That wasn't the only time I'd tried to help Jake. I'd lent him money for rent payments at least 6 different times, and he'd never paid me back once. I'd written recommendation letters for jobs and vouched for his character to potential employers, only to have him get fired within weeks for showing up late, calling in sick excessively, or failing drug tests. I'd driven him to job interviews, helped him write resumes, and even bought him interview clothes with my own money. I'd paid for his phone bill when he claimed he needed it to job hunt, covered his car insurance when he said he needed transportation to work, and bought him groceries when he claimed to be too broke to eat. Every single time, Jake would take advantage of my help and then disappear when it was time to follow through on his promises or pay me back. He'd ghost me for months, ignoring my calls and messages until the next crisis hit and he needed something else. A week after Jake's initial phone call, my parents invited me to dinner at their house. I should have known it wasn't going to be a casual family meal when my mother specified that they needed to discuss something important with me. When I arrived at their house that Sunday evening, I could see the disappointment and frustration written all over both of their faces. My father, who usually let my mother do most of the talking during family conflicts, took the lead this time. "Emma, your mother and I have been talking, and we're very concerned about your attitude toward your brother's situation. We raised you to be compassionate and supportive of family, and frankly, we're disappointed in how you're handling this. Dad, I understand you're worried about Jake, but you have to understand my perspective too," I tried to explain. "I've helped Jake multiple times over the years, and it's never worked out. He takes advantage of people's kindness and then disappears when it's time to be responsible." My mother jumped in with obvious frustration in her voice. "Emma, Jake has been clean and sober for 8 months. He's been working steadily and trying to rebuild his life. This eviction wasn't his fault. His roommate abandoned him. He just needs a temporary place to stay while he gets back on his feet." I later discovered that Jake's version of events was heavily edited. He had been clean for 8 months, which was true, but he'd been fired from his restaurant job 6 weeks earlier for repeated tardiness and attitude problems with management. His roommate hadn't abandoned him. Jake had been unable to pay his share of the rent because he'd lost his income and had been spending money on things other than basic expenses. But in that moment, sitting in my childhood dining room with my parents staring at me like I was a stranger, I didn't know the full truth. I only knew that something about Jake's story felt familiar and suspicious, like so many of his previous crisis narratives. Even if everything Jake told you is completely accurate, I still don't think having him live in my house is a good idea, I said carefully. "We've tried this before, and it ended badly for everyone involved. I need to protect my own stability and peace of mind." That's when my father delivered what felt like an ultimatum. "Emma, if you don't help your brother when he desperately needs support from his family, then maybe you need to reconsider what family means to you. We've always been proud of your success and accomplishments, but success means nothing if it makes you forget where you came from and who helped you get where you are." The implication was clear. If I didn't let Jake move in with me, I would be choosing my own comfort over family loyalty, and that would fundamentally change how my parents viewed me as a daughter and as a person. My mother added her own emotional manipulation to the conversation. "Emma, What if something terrible happens to Jake because he has nowhere safe to stay? What if he ends up homeless on the streets or relapses because he's desperate and hopeless? Will you be able to live with yourself knowing you could have prevented it? The guilt was overwhelming. These were the people who had raised me, supported my dreams, paid for my education, and celebrated every milestone in my life. They were asking me to help my brother, their son, during what they believed was a genuine crisis. How could I refuse without seeming heartless and selfish? But I also knew that giving in to emotional manipulation wasn't healthy for anyone involved, including Jake. Enabling his irresponsible behavior by constantly providing safety nets wasn't helping him learn to be self-sufficient and accountable for his choices. I need some time to think about this, I said finally, hoping to buy myself space to figure out how to handle the situation without completely destroying my relationship with my parents or compromising my own well-being. There's nothing to think about, my mother said coldly. Either you care about your family or you don't. Either you're the kind of person who helps others when they're struggling, or you're the kind of person who only looks out for herself. 3. Days after that difficult dinner with my parents, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I started investigating Jake's story myself. Something about the timing and details of his eviction didn't add up, and I needed to know the truth before making such a significant decision. I started by calling Jake's former roommate, Tyler, whose number I'd gotten from Jake's phone when he left it at our parents' house during a family dinner months earlier. Tyler and I had never been close, but we'd met several times, and he'd always seemed like a decent, responsible guy who was trying to be a good influence on Jake. What Tyler told me was completely different from the story Jake had told our family. "Emma, I didn't abandon Jake," Tyler said, sounding frustrated and hurt. "I've been trying to help him for months, but he's been lying to everyone about what's really been going on." According to Tyler, Jake had been fired from his restaurant job not because of downsizing or economic issues, but because he'd been caught stealing money from the register during his shifts. The manager had given Jake multiple warnings about tardiness and poor performance, but the theft was the final straw that got him terminated. After losing his job, Jake hadn't been actively looking for new employment like he claimed. Instead, he'd been spending his days sleeping until afternoon and his evenings hanging out with old friends who were still using drugs and alcohol. Tyler suspected that Jake had started using again, though he hadn't caught him in the act. "I tried to be patient and supportive," Tyler explained. "I covered his share of the rent for 2 months, thinking he'd find another job and pay me back. But he kept making excuses and promises he didn't keep. When I finally told him he needed to start paying his share or find somewhere else to live, he got angry and accused me of being an unsupportive friend." Tyler also revealed that Jake had been bringing people over to their apartment for what appeared to be drug deals, strangers who would show up at odd hours, stay for just a few minutes, and leave quickly. When Tyler confronted Jake about it, Jake claimed they were just friends stopping by, but Tyler wasn't convinced. The most shocking revelation came when Tyler told me about Jake's current financial situation. "Emma, Jake isn't broke because he lost his job. He's broke because he's been spending money on cocaine and alcohol instead of rent and food. I found drug paraphernalia in his room multiple times, and he'd always claim it belonged to someone else or that he was just holding it for a friend." I felt sick to my stomach as Tyler continued. "I really wanted to help him, but I couldn't afford to subsidize his addiction anymore. My own financial stability was being threatened because I was covering for him. When I gave him notice to leave, he told me he was going to ask his family for help, and that his sister had a big house with extra rooms. So Jake had been planning to manipulate me into housing him for weeks, maybe months. He'd crafted a story, designed to generate maximum sympathy from our parents, knowing they would pressure me to help. The desperate phone call hadn't been a sudden crisis. It had been a calculated manipulation based on his knowledge of our family dynamics. But the revelations didn't stop there. I decided to call Jake's former employer at the restaurant to confirm Tyler's story. The manager, Maria, was initially hesitant to share details, but when I explained that Jake was asking to move in with me and I needed to understand his current situation, she opened up. "I really wanted to help Jake succeed," Maria told me. "He could be charming and funny when he was having good days and customers liked him, but his behavior became increasingly unreliable and problematic. He'd call in sick frequently, usually on weekends when we were busiest. When he did show up, he was often late and seemed unfocused and irritable. The theft incident that led to his firing had been captured on the restaurant's security cameras. Jake had been taking money from the register during busy periods when he thought no one would notice, probably to fund his resumed drug habit. When confronted with the video evidence, Jake had denied everything and claimed he was being set up by other employees who didn't like him. "I've seen addiction destroy a lot of people over the years," Maria said sadly. Jake seemed like he was doing better for a while, but something changed a few months ago. "I hope he gets the help he needs, but I couldn't continue to employ someone I couldn't trust." Armed with the truth about Jake's situation, I made the difficult decision to confront my family during our regular Sunday dinner the following week. I knew this conversation would be painful and potentially damage my relationships with my parents, but I couldn't allow them to continue pressuring me based on lies and manipulation. I arrived at my parents' house that evening with printed copies of Tyler's contact information and Maria's restaurant details, prepared to present evidence that would expose Jake's deception. Jake was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with our parents, probably preparing to launch another round of guilt trips and emotional manipulation. "Before we talk about housing arrangements, I think everyone needs to know what's really been happening with Jake," I announced, setting my folder of information on the table. The room went silent, and I could see Jake's face pale as he realized I'd been investigating his story. "Emma, what are you talking about?" my mother asked, looking confused and slightly irritated. "We already know what happened. Jake's roommate left him with rent he couldn't afford after he lost his job." "That's not what happened, Mom," I said, looking directly at Jake as I spoke. Jake was fired for stealing money from his employer. His roommate covered his rent for 2 months while Jake lied about looking for work and spent money on drugs instead of basic expenses. Jake immediately went on the defensive. "Emma, that's not true. Tyler is lying because he's angry about the roommate situation, and my former boss is just trying to cover up her own management problems. You're believing strangers over your own." "Brother?" But I had evidence, and I presented it methodically. "I have Tyler's phone number. You can call him yourselves and ask about Jake's behavior over the past few months. I have the restaurant manager's contact information. She can tell you about the security footage of Jake stealing from the register." My father looked stunned and hurt. "Jake, is this true? Have you been lying to us about what happened?" Jake's response was textbook manipulation, deflection, victimization, and blame shifting. "I made some mistakes, okay? But everyone's making it sound worse than it was. I was struggling with depression and anxiety after losing my job, and I made some poor choices. But I'm family. Shouldn't family forgive mistakes and help each other through tough times?" "Jake, this isn't about forgiveness," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "This is about a pattern of lying and manipulation that's been going on for years. You told Mom and Dad that your eviction wasn't your fault, that you've been sober for 8 months, that you've been actively job hunting. None of that is true." My mother looked back and forth between Jake and me, clearly struggling to process this new information. "Emma, even if Jake made mistakes, he's still our son and your brother. People deserve second chances, especially family." "Mom, this isn't Jake's second chance," I replied. "This is his 15th or 20th chance. How many times are we going to enable his destructive behavior by rescuing him from consequences? How many times are we going to let him lie to us and manipulate us because we're afraid of seeming unsupportive?" Jake stood up from the table, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "I can't believe my own sister would sabotage me like this. I came to you for help during the worst time in my life, and you're trying to turn everyone against me with lies and rumors." "They're not lies, Jake," I said firmly, "and I'm not trying to turn anyone against you. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about your actual situation so we can make informed decisions about how to help you, if that's even possible at this point." The confrontation escalated quickly after that. Jake accused me of being jealous, of the attention he received from our parents, of being cold and selfish and caring more about my possessions than my family. My parents were caught in the middle, torn between their desire to support their struggling son and their growing realization that he'd been deceiving them. My father, who rarely raised his voice, finally exploded. "Jake, I am so tired of the lies. Do you think we're stupid? Do you think we haven't noticed the patterns over the years? Emma is trying to help us understand what's really happening so we can figure out how to actually help you instead of just enabling you. The evening ended with Jake storming out of the house, claiming that his family had abandoned him and that he was better off on his own. My parents sat in shocked silence, processing the reality that their son had been manipulating them for months, maybe years. The aftermath of that explosive family dinner was even more complicated and painful than I had anticipated. While my parents were initially grateful that I'd uncovered the truth about Jake's situation, the revelation created new tensions and divisions that affected every relationship in our family. Jake disappeared for several weeks after the confrontation. He wasn't answering phone calls or text messages from any of us, and nobody knew where he was staying or how he was surviving. My parents were consumed with worry, alternating between anger at Jake's deception and fear that something terrible had happened to him. My mother, in particular, struggled with guilt about not recognizing the signs of Jake's relapse and manipulation. "How did I not see what was happening?" she asked me during a tearful phone conversation. "How did I let him fool me so completely? What kind of mother doesn't know when her son is lying about something so serious?" I tried to explain that Jake had become an expert manipulator over the years, that he knew exactly which buttons to push to generate sympathy and support from family members who loved him and wanted to believe he was making progress. But while my parents appreciated my honesty about Jake's situation, some of them began to question whether my investigation had been necessary or helpful. My father wondered aloud whether exposing Jake's lies had been worth the risk of pushing him away from the family completely. "What if he's sleeping on the street somewhere?" my father asked during one of our conversations. "What if he's using drugs again because he feels hopeless and abandoned? Maybe we should have just helped him and dealt with the other issues later." The guilt and second-guessing were overwhelming for all of us. Had I done the right thing by insisting on the truth, even if it meant Jake might end up in more dangerous situations? Was family loyalty more important than honesty and accountability? My extended family's reactions were mixed and often hurtful. Some relatives supported my decision to investigate Jake's claims and establish boundaries around helping him. Others felt that I had been unnecessarily harsh and detective-like in my approach, that family members should trust each other and offer unconditional support during crises. My aunt, my mother's sister, called me to express her disappointment in how I'd handled the situation. "Emma, I understand that Jake has problems, but publicly humiliating him at a family dinner was cruel. You could have talked to him privately, given him a chance to tell the truth voluntarily. Instead, you ambushed him with evidence like you were a prosecutor in court." Some of my cousins stopped talking to me entirely, convinced that I had caused unnecessary drama and hurt within the family. Others reached out privately to share their own experiences with Jake's manipulation and to thank me for finally confronting the elephant in the room that everyone had been ignoring. The most painful response came from my grandmother, who called me a week after the dinner. "Emma, sweetheart, I know Jake has made mistakes, but family is supposed to forgive and support each other. I'm worried that you've become too focused on being right instead of being loving." Her words cut deep because my grandmother's opinion had always mattered so much to me. She represented old-fashioned values of family loyalty and unconditional love, and her disappointment made me question whether I had lost perspective in my effort to protect myself and establish healthy boundaries. Meanwhile, my parents were dealing with their own guilt and regret about enabling Jake's behavior for so many years. They began to see how their constant rescue missions had prevented Jake from experiencing natural consequences and learning to be self-sufficient. "We thought we were helping him," my mother said during one of our conversations, "but maybe we were just making it easier for him to avoid growing up and taking responsibility for his choices." 6 months after that explosive family dinner, Jake resurfaced in a way none of us expected. He called me directly, not our parents, and his voice was different, clearer, more grounded, less manipulative than I'd heard in years. "Emma, I know you probably don't want to hear from me," he began, "but I need to tell you some things, and I need to thank you for what you did, even though I hated you for it at the time." Jake explained that after leaving our parents' house that night, he had spent several weeks sleeping in his car and staying in cheap motels, using the last of his money to fund his cocaine habit. The reality of being truly homeless, without family safety nets to fall back on, had been a wake-up call that previous consequences hadn't provided. I kept waiting for Mom and Dad to call and offer to help, or for you to change your mind and let me move in, he admitted. When that didn't happen, when I realized I had burned all my bridges with family and friends, I had to face the fact that I was completely alone and completely responsible for my own survival. The turning point had come when Jake was arrested for drug possession and spent 3 days in jail before anyone in our family even knew what had happened. Sitting in that cell, he realized that his addiction and manipulation had cost him everything that mattered: his relationships, his health, his self-respect, and his family's trust. I called a rehab program myself this time, Jake continued. Not because Mom and Dad were pressuring me, not because a judge ordered it, but because I finally understood that I was going to die if I didn't get help. And I've been clean for 4 months now, really clean, not just pretending to be clean while I figured out new ways to manipulate people. The most surprising part of our conversation was when Jake thanked me for refusing to let him move in with me. Emma, if you had said yes, if you had let me into your house, I would have destroyed your life the same way I destroyed Tyler's apartment situation. I would have lied to you, stolen from you, and brought chaos into the peaceful space you worked so hard to create. He explained that the therapy he'd been receiving in rehab had helped him understand the patterns of manipulation and enabling that had defined our family dynamics for years. I learned how to identify people's weaknesses and use guilt and sympathy to get what I wanted. I knew exactly how to make Mom and Dad feel responsible for my problems. I knew exactly which buttons to push to make you feel guilty for being successful when I was struggling. Jake's therapist had helped him see that my refusal to house him hadn't been cruel or selfish. It had been the most loving thing anyone in our family had done for him in years. By refusing to enable his destructive behavior, I had forced him to face consequences that ultimately motivated him to seek real help. The therapist calls it tough love, Jake explained. She said that people who truly care about addicts sometimes have to let them hit rock bottom instead of constantly providing safety nets. It was the hardest thing I've ever been through, but it was also the only thing that worked. Jake had been living in a sober living house for the past 3 months, working a job at a grocery store and attending daily AA meetings. He was paying his own rent, managing his own expenses, and building genuine friendships with other people in recovery who understood his struggles without enabling his destructive patterns. I'm not calling to ask for anything, Jake said toward the end of our conversation. I'm not ready to ask for forgiveness or trust, because I know I haven't earned those things yet. I just wanted you to know that you were right to protect yourself and your boundaries. You were right to demand honesty instead of accepting my lies. And you were right to love me enough to let me fail. The conversation with Jake led to gradual healing within our family, though it took time and ongoing effort from everyone involved. My parents began attending Al-Anon meetings to understand their own role in enabling Jake's addiction and to learn healthier ways of supporting him without rescuing him from consequences. My mother called me a few weeks after Jake and I talked. Emma, I owe you an apology, she said. I was so focused on protecting Jake from pain that I couldn't see I was actually preventing him from growing up. You saw what we couldn't see, and you had the courage to do what we couldn't do. My father, who had always struggled with expressing emotions directly, sent me a handwritten letter that I'll treasure forever. Emma, I'm proud of the strong, principled woman you've become. You stood up for what was right even when it was difficult and lonely. That takes character that not everyone possesses. So, after hearing my complete story with all its complicated layers and painful revelations, I want to ask you, do you think I was wrong for not wanting my brother to move into my house? Was I being selfish and heartless, or was I protecting both myself and Jake by refusing to enable his destructive patterns? Some people have told me I should have just said yes and dealt with the consequences later, that family should always come, first regardless of past behavior. Others have said I was absolutely right to establish boundaries and demand honesty before making such a significant commitment. This situation taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to rescue them from the natural consequences of their choices. It taught me that enabling destructive behavior, even with good intentions, can actually prevent people from getting the help they truly need. I also learned that setting boundaries with family members is incredibly difficult, but sometimes absolutely necessary for everyone's well-being. It's possible to love someone deeply while still protecting yourself from their destructive patterns. Jake and I are rebuilding our relationship slowly and carefully. He's been clean for over a year now, has his own apartment, and is working steadily. We talk regularly, but we've both learned to base our relationship on honesty and mutual respect rather than guilt and obligation. My parents and I are closer than we've been in years because we're no longer caught up in crisis management and enabling behaviors. We can enjoy each other's company without constantly worrying about Jake's next emergency or manipulation. I genuinely want to hear your perspective on this situation. Have you ever been in a position where you had to choose between helping family and protecting your own well-being? How do you balance family loyalty with personal boundaries? Where do you draw the line between supporting someone and enabling their destructive behavior? Do you think I was right to investigate Jake's claims, or should I have trusted him and offered help based on faith rather than facts? Was the family confrontation necessary, or could I have handled the situation more privately and gently? Leave your honest, thoughtful opinions in the comments below. I read every single comment and really value hearing different perspectives on these complex family dynamics. If you found my story helpful or thought-provoking, please subscribe to the channel for more real-life stories about family relationships, boundary setting, and personal growth. And don't miss the next recommended video, where I'll be sharing another controversial story about the time I had to choose between supporting a friend's wedding and standing up for my own moral principles. That situation created drama that you won't believe. Thank you so much for listening to my story and for engaging with these difficult questions about family, addiction, and personal responsibility. Your support means everything to me, and I'll see you in the next video.